all to this, the second in a series of events from the AHSN network, which aim to share experience from across the NHS on environmental sustainability issues, so that we can all learn from each other's knowledge and experience. And this session is around the reducing carbon impact from anaesthetic gases. Next slide, please, Rox. So the price of admission is always to listen to me for a few minutes. So first of all, just running through the housekeeping. As you can see from the slide, we're going to be recording the session. This is so it's accessible to you and to others who couldn't be here today after the event. And we will circulate the link so that you can share it with your colleagues. Please do that. If you aren't presenting, please can you turn off your microphone and camera to reduce bandwidth? And please make full use of the chat function. One of the amazing things about the last event that we ran was the collaboration that took place in the chat, and we'd really encourage that to happen again. We have a real audience on the call today, including anaesthetists, sustainability leads, policy leads, management and researchers. So the content of the presentation varies. There should be something for everybody. Next slide, please, Rox. It's one about the agenda. We skipped on slightly too far. Just to show you the agenda, there we go. It's a packed agenda. We've built in time for questions. Speakers, if you could keep to your time, and I may have to nudge you along, so apologies in advance. The first session is pre-recorded for us, so that is a video, just to make you aware of that. Next slide, Rox. So firstly, I just want to run through what the academic health science networks are and what the network is, what we do and why we're active in this space. So there are 15 AHSNs and we're commissioned by NHS England and Improvement. We form a network of networks and our role is to support the widespread uptake of innovation and improvement activity. Effectively, we're the key innovation arm of the NHS. We're all slightly different, so each AHSN shapes itself around the needs of its local communities and its integrated care systems. But we share a set of local priorities and goals, and this includes supporting the NHS to deliver its net zero commitments through identifying new products, technologies and ways of working that support this agenda. And to do this, we've developed our network environmental sustainability strategy. Next slide, please, Rox. So you can see the strategy here. It has 4 parts. So the first is doing what every business should be doing. We're reducing our own carbon footprint and environmental impact. The second is to work with companies that we're already supporting. So we support a number of companies across the 15 that have innovations that will make a difference to patient benefit, patient outcomes or costs. So we're supporting them to make their existing innovations more green. How do they reduce the harm that is caused to the environment? And that's, for example, looking at their supply chain. Thirdly, we're actively looking for innovations that can reduce the harm caused through the delivery of healthcare. So what is new that is out there that we can adopt and help spread across the NHS? And finally, we have a brokering role. So we're looking at spreading good practice from other sectors into the NHS and vice versa. And we hope that this will enable us to deliver our ambitions. We want to build a movement by sharing best practice across the AHSN network and across the NHS. And this event is one of the factors of that movement. We want to work with innovators on products, services and practices, as I've just described. This is a big one. We want to influence policy that's locally and nationally that encourages the uptake of innovation in this space more quickly. So as an example, we worked with the NHS supply chain so that they could more quickly approve and take up a piece of PPE that was reusable. And finally, we want to calculate the impact of what we've managed to do so that we can promote even more uptake. If we can show the impact of our innovations, then the NHS is more likely to want to take it up. Next slide, please, Rox. So at the last event we had, we described the following steps for the AHSN network, and these are still in train. So we're working internally to measure the impact of our programmes. So as an example, we spread a diagnostic test that identified preeclampsia in pregnant women, and it keeps women out of hospital if they don't have the condition. So that keeping women out of hospital settings saved approximately 1,000 tonnes of carbon. We're understanding the potential environmental impact of innovators. So that's, for example, working through the Small Business Research Initiative that is giving out grants to innovators with an idea that will impact on this space. And also through, as another example, the Yorkshire and Humber Innovation Accelerator, Propel Net Zero. We're raising awareness and educating our own staff around environmental sustainability, and that's internally, but that is so our staff are better equipped to help the NHS and support staff in the NHS. We're forming partnerships with like-minded organisations and individuals so that we can be more than the sum of our parts. And if you come from an organisation that you think could usefully partner with the AHSN network, please do get in touch. And finally, we're planning a series of events like this one around your priorities. We've got a group that's been set up to identify future topics and speakers. The next event is due in January, February, and will be around asthma inhalers. So we're going to hold them quarterly, and if there are topics you would like to see covered, again, please let us know. I want to be really clear that this is just a start for us. We've been tasked with going bigger and bolder. It's what we want to do. So it's really a case of watch this space. We want to do more. So thank you for listening to me. I hope you find this webinar useful, informative and interesting. And I'd like to hand over now to the video from Dr. Tom Pearce, who's the Environmental Advisor to the President of the Royal College of Anaesthetists. Thank you very much. Is it going to work?
A very good morning to you, and thank you very much for inviting me to address you and those in the Oxford Academic Health Science Network. My presentation today is entitled Reducing the Impact of Anaesthetic Gases. My name is Tom Pearce, and I work as the Environmental Advisor to the Royal College of Anaesthetists, and my day job is to give anaesthesia for patients requiring heart surgery in Southampton. Measurement is everything. In anaesthetic practice, when thinking and considering drugs we use to treat and manage our patients, the dose of drug we give is described as a volume or a mass per kilogram of the patient's weight. Sometimes, however, we choose to use concentrations as our measure, either as a percentage or a partial pressure, for example. And particularly when we're considering total intravenous anaesthesia, we might convert this into a blood concentration. But thinking of volatile anaesthetic agents, and I'm going to include nitrous oxide in this, we dial up a percentage to be delivered with the fresh gas flow rate to that particular patient. We don't link that with the mass of drug that is being used. Now, what about the mass of drug? It's the mass, of course, that defines the quantity of raw materials or source molecules that are required to make the final product. Sometimes we can define this in terms of process efficiency, and very often in manufacturing a drug, there will be multiple steps, and each one of those has a certain yield or efficiency. Sometimes those in production engineering can turn this into a concept called the process mass intensity, which relates to the mass of the raw materials required to make a kilogram of the active pharmaceutical ingredient. And those intermediate steps in the manufacturing process may have environmental consequences. Once administered to a patient, the mass that's given then has to be metabolized or excreted. And considering volatile anaesthetic agents, it's that mass once breathed out that contributes to global warming. We address this with an app that defined for any of the app users the carbon dioxide equivalence of an hour's anaesthetic. And in the example here, the carrier gas mixture is a mixture of oxygen and air, a total flow of 1 litre, 40% of which is oxygen. And looking to the right, you'll see the purple, which indicates isoflurane, the yellow, which indicates sevoflurane, and the blue, which indicates desflurane. Now, those are dialed up in similarly potent concentrations. Isoflurane being the most potent, you don't need much of that to give the same anesthetic effect as you would desflurane, for example, which requires 5.5%. And look at the difference in the carbon dioxide equivalence between those three agents. Enormous for desflurane and very modest for sevoflurane. Now, that itself depended upon the concept that the tool defines the mass used. And I'm very pleased to be able to share with you this slide. Rob Taylor and I were able to compare the theoretical mass of a volatile anesthetic used with the actual mass in 5 different vaporizers. The slight spectrum there of variability depends upon the accuracy with which the vaporizer is calibrated. But nonetheless, the app gives you a pretty good idea of the mass that's used. And actually looking at this in a bar chart format, I've compared here those same 3 anesthetic agents, sevoflurane, isoflurane, and desflurane, at equi-potential dosages, and I've altered the fresh gas flow rate from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 litres a minute. Look, if you can, at the enormous mass of drug that's used when profligate fresh gas flow rates are used with desflurane. This is 80 grams. We often think of drugs in terms of milligrams, but this is 80 grams per hour. And because desflurane is a very potent global warming agent, look at the effect on the CO2 equivalence of 4 litres of desflurane set at 5%. It's about 1/4 of a tonne of CO2 equivalents per hour of anaesthetic. Now, put that in context, the average UK commute to work for the working week emits about 1 tonne of CO2. You can see how big it is. Thinking about nitrous oxide is important. In this particular example, I've chosen to use an oxygen nitrous oxide mix. And if you glance at the setting for the isoflurane vaporizer, you'll see that that is 19.2. In other words, that is the component that is due entirely to nitrous oxide. And this particular bar chart here demonstrates something very similar, either giving sevoflurane in an oxygen air mix or administering sevoflurane in a nitrous oxide mix. And you can see the enormous difference in the CO2 equivalents over the range 1 to 4 litres of fresh gas flow rate a minute. So how can we conclude these data? Well, I think first and foremost, we must choose an agent with a low global warming potential. And in this instance, that's sevoflurane. We should really avoid a less potent agent, desflurane, not simply because of the mass that's used, but also because of its high global warming potential. We should always, in anaesthesia practice, use low fresh gas flow rates and pass those through an absorber. We can limit the amount of material that's used, in this case, the volatile agent and our fresh gas flow. And lastly, if it's safe, we should avoid nitrous oxide. Now we need to go behind the scenes here a little bit. This diagram illustrates the 2 routes by which we can manufacture one particular drug. And the drug I've chosen to illustrate this with is sevoflurane. You can either choose route A or route B. Route A starts with products with high global warming potentials. Well, you say that shouldn't matter if it's all being converted to sevoflurane. But what if there are losses of those agents in the manufacturing process? In other words, the raw materials and intermediate steps are adding to global warming. We turn our attention to route B, and this synthetic pathway, there are no agents or intermediaries in that path with high global warming potentials. Now, the problem we're faced with is that we do not know which one of those routes is chosen by the manufacturer. And that means that we could call it embedded CO2 inside the manufacturing process. So perhaps it's possible that sevoflurane is not as green as we once thought it was. Considering our use of nitrous oxide, I've got the best data from our own hospitals in Southampton. And I've been able to obtain from the BOC, our medical gas supplier, the annual cylinder return data from way back to 2008 up to 2020. And from that data, I've been able to convert it into a carbon dioxide equivalence. And I want to share with you the significant falls that have occurred over those years. First fall occurred when we introduced into clinical practice and anaesthesia delivery semi-open anaesthetic circles. We moved from semi-open anaesthetic circles to system circles. And the result was that we used less fresh gas flow. See the effect of the fall from over 2,000 tons of CO2 equivalents down to less than 1,000. But the next significant fall occurred in 2017 when the department introduced into clinical practice the end tidal control as a way of minimizing fresh gas flow rates still further. Now, I grant you that the fall seen in 2020 may be partly due to that of COVID, but nonetheless, the result was that we've reduced our use of nitrous oxide by 80% within our hospital trust. Now, the same can't be said for the nitrous oxide that goes into Entonox. What I've got here is the pipeline Entonox use, again expressed as tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. And the trend has been slower, but downwards for the most part over the years 2008 to 2020. Some of the maternity use of nitrous oxide is from portable cylinders, but that's not all the whole story. And having said that, there is a trend in this direction, and that's very reassuring. What about the national figures? This particular illustration was provided to me from the Sustainable Development Unit and presented first in Glasgow in 2019. The idea behind it is to express the various components that go into the carbon footprint throughout the NHS of the volatile agents and our use of nitrous oxide. And we must remember that nitrous oxide is not just used in maternity for analgesia, but also in the ED, ambulance service, and then, of course, nitrous oxide in the clinical anaesthetic setting too. And this illustration was to give us some idea of what the total amount was. But if you could take away from this, it's 500,000 tons of CO2 equivalents per year, you'll be pretty close to the answer. And the idea here in the trend line over to the right-hand side of my slide is an attempt to show the trajectory that we need to be following in order to achieve net zero. So my additional conclusions is that there has been a local fall in Southampton and a national fall in the use of nitrous oxide for anaesthesia. That's a personal communication that I've received from Peter Henrys. There's been a lesser fall in the use of nitrous oxide. And I would conclude, therefore, that if you wish to address nitrous oxide cracking, and its conversion into its oxygen and nitrogen components, then the place to put that apparatus would be where it's used most, in the maternity suite. I've mentioned that there is hidden, and I'm put in brackets there, embedded CO2 in the manufacture of all drugs. And with specific reference to the volatile agents, I believe there is scope for vapor capture, reprocessing of that captured vapor, and subsequent reuse and readministration to other patients down the line. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope you found that interesting. And we're now going to move on to two presentations, firstly from Joy Hirst and Rajit Khosla, and then from James Hyde. So Joy and Rajit are from the East Lancashire Hospitals NHS Trust, and James is from the Green NHS team in NHS England and Improvement. If you've got questions, please do put them in the chat and I will pick them up and ask them at the end when we have a Q&A session. So Joy, over to you.
Hello everyone. My name's Joy Hirst. I'm an anaesthetic registrar in the Northwest, and I'm going to tell you about our project called Greening the Anaesthetic Room, which we did at our hospital in East Lancs. So next slide, please. The reason we did this is because, as we just heard, anaesthetic gases are bad for the environment. They all have a global warming potential. And along with metered-dose inhalers, they account for about 5% of NHS emissions. So the main gases that we use, or volatile agents that we use, are sevoflurane and desflurane. They're both bad, but desflurane is much worse and has a global warming potential of about 2,540. And CO2, as a reference, is 1. So it's 2,500 times worse than carbon dioxide, broadly speaking. And using desflurane at 6.6% for 2 litres a minute for an hour, which might be enough to keep, would be enough to keep someone asleep for an hour, is equivalent to driving 378 miles in a car. So it has a big environmental burden, and it's also expensive. So we carried out this project with the aim of reducing our desflurane use in the department. So what did we do? Next slide, please. This project is inspired by similar projects at Raigmore Hospital in Scotland, and also from the Welsh Environmental Anaesthetic Network. And we sort of copied what they did. A consultant in our department took all the desflurane vaporisers off the machines and he put them in a cupboard. And that was in January 2020. And he just made it inconvenient to use desflurane. You could request it if you wanted to use it, and you could go to the cupboard and put it back on your machine. But he made it a bit inconvenient. And then we collected data after a year from the pharmacy, and we collected data for the last 4 years, from February 2017 to February 21. And we looked at the number of bottles of desflurane and sevoflurane that were ordered. And from that, we calculated a monthly cost and also the CO2 equivalents for this time period. Next slide, please. So here's a graph of our results, and I'm sorry, the writing's very small, so I'll just describe it. This graph shows the monthly usage of sevoflurane and desflurane against carbon dioxide equivalents. So the x-axis on the bottom is months over the 4-year period, and on the left axis is number of bottles, and the right y-axis is the carbon dioxide equivalents. The yellow line that you see there shows the amount of sevoflurane that's used, and the blue line shows the amount of desflurane used. The green bars denote the carbon dioxide equivalents. So you can see that usage of sevo and desflurane was reasonably stable. And then where there is the red arrow, that shows the removal of desflurane from the anaesthetic machines. And soon after that, in March 2020, the coronavirus pandemic came along. So there is a sharp fall in use of both agents because of the pandemic, and that reflects a reduced operating capacity. As our operating increased again, you can see the yellow line increases for sevoflurane, and the desflurane use remains low. And with the green bars, you can see that our carbon dioxide equivalents on a monthly basis has dropped quite significantly. Next slide, please. This is a very similar looking graph, just to show you the cost savings that we've made. So everything's the same, except for the green bars now represent monthly costs in pounds. And again, you can see a sharp fall in cost in March 2020 because of the pandemic, and then operating has increased again. Costs have gone up, but not up to previous levels. Next slide, please. In terms of our results, we showed a dramatic reduction in carbon dioxide equivalents by 4,500 tonnes, which represented an 84% fall in emissions from volatiles in our department. To put that into context for you, that's similar to driving 11.3 million miles in a car, and they're really big numbers. I was kind of astounded by that, really. We had accompanying cost savings of just over £100,000 too. We have to say some of those savings, environmental and cost savings, are due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but we do have evidence of change in practice. When I looked at the share of volatile use before the intervention, sevoflurane held 75.7% of the share and desflurane 24.3%. After our intervention and removal of desflurane from the machines, that share changed. So sevoflurane represented 96% and desflurane just 4%. So although some of our savings are due to the pandemic and the reduced operating capacity, we can show a change in practice in our department. Next slide, please. So we've shown that this very simple intervention can make massive environmental savings of over 4,500 tonnes of CO2 equivalents and cost savings of just over £100,000 in our department. We said that some of the savings are due to the pandemic, but not all. We made some projected financial savings for the next financial year of just over £80,000 based on our current operating capacity. And in response to this, we've just reduced ordering desflurane. We started to distribute posters in the anaesthetic room to encourage people to practice green anaesthesia. We distribute green to the department every 6 months, and we now have a sustainability lead in the department to drive this idea of green anaesthesia. Next slide, please. I think my key messages from this project is that all healthcare departments have a responsibility to reduce emissions, and anaesthesia is no exception. And actually, you know, reducing our desflurane use was really straightforward, and we saved a massive amount in terms of CO2 equivalents, and also we saved a lot of money. And there was really little resistance to change. We just made it inconvenient to use the drug, and so people mainly didn't use it. So kind of my key messages is, in terms of practicing green anaesthesia, is avoid desflurane, avoid using any volatiles where possible, and instead use reasonable anaesthesia. When you do use volatiles, use low or ultra low flows to limit the volume or the mass of drug that you're giving. I can take any questions if you have them. Oh, I think you're muted, Kathy.
Now
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you. That was really interesting. There are lots of questions coming through in the chat. We're going to hear from Jamie first and then take questions together. So thank you. Okay. Oh, I seem to have the wrong copy of the agenda. Apologies for that. It's, not only am I on mute, but I'm also looking at the wrong thing. So the next presentation is from Rajit and Shahid from East Lancashire Hospitals. Thank you.
Hi, so my name is Raj, and I'm presenting this with Bilal. So we are both ST5 anaesthetists who were based at Blackburn last year, and we'll be doing this project along with Jason Lee in parallel probably to the previous project that we're showing. So with this project, we were targeting nitrous oxide, and it's based off the project that was done in Scotland in Lothian, which is the nitrous oxide mitigation project. Not looking at how nitrous oxide is used clinically, but more looking at the supplies of nitrous oxide and whether we're using them efficiently or not. Next slide, please. So firstly, just looking at how nitrous oxide is stored at East Lancashire. So at each of the two sites of East Lancashire, they had a manifold. So the manifold will consist of 6 cylinders on each bank, and there's 2 banks with the manifold controller in the middle. And as the one side empties, the manifold will switch to the other side and use the other side. Each manifold is made up of each bank is made up of 6 cylinders, which each contain 6 G cylinders, which are about 9,000 litres each. So in total, each side of the bank has 54,000 litres of nitrous oxide, and altogether it's 108,000 litres of nitrous oxide. In this project, we're just mainly going to talk about the Blackburn side, but the same thing was also in the Burnley site as well. Next slide, please. So what we actually did was it was a sort of a 3-stage process. So what we wanted to look at is how much nitrous oxide we use at the manifold level and how much we're actually using clinically, and compare the two. So what we did first was in the first stage, we just went to the estates department and asked to look at the actual manifold itself. And then look at the logbooks to track how many cylinder changes and bank changes they've had over time, and what sort of usage that we'd be looking at from that side. In our second stage, what we did was we looked at the logbook data from the anaesthetic machines. So each machine had a backup of basically how much anaesthetic it used after each patient, and so we just collected that data over a couple of weeks, and then we ran it again and looking at all anaesthetics over the period of May and June as well. And then finally what we did was we did a quick survey of all the anaesthetists in the department, asking them what their actual nitrous oxide habits and usage was. Next slide, please. So what we found was as I said, I'll talk mainly about the Blackburn site. So what we found was that there was a big difference between the manifold consumption and what we actually clinically used. If we actually looked at how much we were using, so per month we're looking at around 300,000 litres of nitrous oxide was consumed by the manifold, which adds up to over 4 million litres a year used by at the manifold level. But actually, when you actually looked at what the machine said they were using probably around 1,000 litres a month, or about 10,800 litres annually. And how that actually fed into cost was that the annual actual cost of the manifold was we're using £12,800 worth of nitrous oxide. But when you actually looked at the clinical side, we're only using £55 worth of nitrous in a year. And if you think and looking at what the environmental burden of that was, it's over 2,500 tons of CO2 per year, purely just by what was being used by the manifold. Next slide, please. And this is just a graph to demonstrate the big difference between the actual usage and manifold usage. So as you can see, the manifold usage is much higher than the actual usage. And actually at this point, this was done in June, we were actually not using the manifold at this point, and we were using cylinders on the back of the anaesthetic machine. So actually what you see in June 2021 is purely leakage from the manifold. Next slide, please. And this is how this compared in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents across all the sites. So as you can see, at Burnley, the 2 manifolds at Burnley will use a much lower amount of nitrous oxide compared to Blackburn, and actually the usage was much higher than Entinox in the birth suite, which I think is always a red flag for a leak if you're using more nitrous oxide than Entinox in a maternity suite. Next slide, please. Bilal.
Okay, thanks, Raj. So I'll just very quickly take over from here just to quickly finish off. So clearly huge numbers. Just to put that into perspective, our yearly consumption in terms of a CO2e equivalent relating to 4 million litres of nitrous oxide is actually equivalent to running a sevoflurane vaporizer at 1 litre flow for 215 years. If you look at a desflurane vaporizer in the same way, it's equivalent to running that at a litre of flow for about 4 years. So not only highlighting the significant environmental impact of nitrous oxide, but also highlighting the big difference just relating to the other topics that we've just had between desflurane and sevoflurane. That's equivalent to the CO2 emissions of about 400 households a year. And if I've got the maths right, it's equivalent to driving 5.5 million miles in a car with average CO2 emissions, which is like getting to the moon 23 times over. So huge numbers with regards to a CO2 equivalent released from purely the manifold in a year at ELHT at the Blackburn site. Next slide, please. And again, just to try and bring this to the outcomes and what we did and the conclusion. So clearly that there's something is going on here. We raised the findings urgently with our medical gases committee and the estates people at trust level. The pipeline was formally leak tested and investigated after isolating it and moving all the anaesthetic machines over to backup portable cylinders whilst the test was being undertaken. We found a major leak in the main theatre complex, which required very extensive, costly and disruptive repair. And the disruption would have been to emergency and trauma lists at the weekend. Looking at the survey, our anaesthetic nitrous oxide use within the department is falling compared to historical use because of more modern agents being available. And we decided as a department and at the trust level that a pipeline repair was just not justifiable, particularly in the current climate. So what we actually decided as a department and with the trust was that we would isolate the nitrous oxide pipeline, we would cap the whole thing off, and we would switch over purely to portable cylinders attached directly to the back of the anaesthetic machines, completely eliminating the need for a pipeline. That's been going on at ELHT since about July to 2021. If you look at the consumption of nitrous oxide within the whole theatre complex, one portable cylinder is enough to last the entire theatre complex for about a month. A poor size E cylinder holds about 1,800 litres, and our monthly estimate is about 1,000 litres at most. So although every theatre and every anaesthetic machine has their own cylinder, you could actually power the whole theatre suite with just one cylinder. Next slide, please. And just to finish off, are we an outlier? Is there a major pipeline leak just at Blackburn? Probably not. So if anyone is here from the nitrous oxide mitigation project or has any involvement in that, I think from our communications with them, they've identified about 15 trusts so far with roughly the same problem. Leaking nitrous oxide manifolds, old pipework, etc. And again, so in our hospital, this has just highlighted the environmental impact of nitrous oxide, and it's also helped to stimulate and grow better communication between different teams within the hospital. Because at the end of the day, the reason why this has gone on for so long is because the nitrous oxide manifold cylinders are replaced by the estates department. They contact pharmacy when they're low, they order new ones. Departments just haven't spoken to each other about how much is actually being used and whether or not what we're filling the manifold with is excessive. I think a lot of assumptions have been made about use, and I think it's just highlighted the need for regular communication between departments that don't normally communicate with each other directly, such as anaesthetics and the estates department. And we have highlighted that we can make improvements with regards to our environmental impact without directly changing clinical practice. And as I said, although we've isolated the main nitrous oxide pipeline, it's still freely available for use to anyone that feels the need to use it clinically. That's it for us. Thank you very much for listening, and we're happy to take any questions directly or in the chat.
Thank you. Vicky, can I just check? I no longer trust the agenda that I had. Is it Q&A now, or are we going over to Jamie?
I would do Q&A because we've had kind of 3 speakers.
Thank you very much. I always like to be told what to do. So we've got a lot of questions, so I've grouped them into, as far as I can, into sort of themes. So the first question is probably actually for Jamie. Is there any funding to help hospitals introduce greener anaesthetic technology as part of greener NHS?
We're working on it, trying our best. I don't have a full answer right now, but I hope so at some point.
Thank you. That would have been my thinking as well. What I think I would say is that if the more people talk about this as an issue and the need for funding, the more likely it is to happen. So people on the call, on the chat, if you're collaborating in the chat, you can collaborate in real life and make things happen here. The next set of questions was around change and culture, and I think really are for Joy. So how did your colleagues react to the change from desflurane? You mentioned that because it was making it difficult for people, there wasn't a huge amount of resistance, which I guess is behavioural economics in action. But I wondered whether you had any issues and whether you supported the change with appropriate education and training.
Yes, so before the change was implemented, which is before my time at the hospital, at one of our departmental meetings, there was a presentation about environmental issues in anaesthesia. And so there was that kind of education beforehand. But then I think it just probably one or two bold consultants that just decided to go for it. And no one was told what they should or shouldn't do, actually. But I think it got the ODPs and the theatre staff on board that when they noticed the desflurane vaporiser on the machine, they should remove it if it wasn't in use, and just put it in the stock cupboard. So I think people appreciated not being told what to do or how to give their anaesthetic. And as they gradually stopped using it because it wasn't there, maybe realised that a lot of the time they didn't miss it. And I think I've noticed certainly over the last kind of 2 years, a culture change in different places that fewer people are using desflurane because it doesn't hold that much advantage for the majority of patients and the majority of surgeries. There are some situations where it's useful, but you know, people have, there seems to be a culture change, certainly in our region, moving away from it again.
That's really good to hear, thank you. And certainly for the AHSNs, our experience of any innovation and getting successful uptake is that you need somebody who captures hearts and minds, and a clinician who sets out the case. It doesn't really matter what level that clinician is, but somebody to champion the innovation is really important. Patient benefits, you've just mentioned there that actually desflurane is not necessarily something that patients need for anaesthesia. Did you notice any difference in patient outcomes?
It's not something we've measured, but just observationally myself, I haven't noticed any difference in outcome. There are some scenarios when you might want to use it, and I think it's probably still reasonable to use, although I'm not totally expert in that. But I've not noticed, any difference day to day in patient outcomes. Thank you.
Be an interesting one to explore. One for the manifold area. Is there no leak monitoring system installed in manifolds?
So there was talk when this leak was going on whether they should be installing some sort of flow meter, but no, in broad senses, no. It's just basically all the monitor they have is that when the pressure goes low, it sets an alarm off, and that sends a message to security, and then they change the manifold, and that's the only sort of monitoring they have.
Thank you. And how did you measure clinical use of, sorry, I'm going to have to read this out as it is. How did you measure clinical use of L in N20 to compare with manifold usage?
So the logbooks in the anaesthetic machines actually tell you in litres how much nitrous oxide they've used in each anaesthetic. So basically we just went through the entire logbook for a month at a time, and then we just added it up, and then we compared it to the manifold. And the manifold, we just calculate it from how many cylinder changes we've had.
Thank you.
Can I just say these are Draeger anaesthetic machines. So if you guys have Draegers, the logbooks should be available on the machine within the settings to track how much, not just nitrous oxide, but how much volatile oxygen, air, etc. you're using. Just bear in mind it's a very detailed logbook and it requires a lot of scrolling.
Yeah, it takes quite a long time to go through the logbook.
Okay, so in addition to a champion, you also need people who are really happy with that detail. Has anybody validated the calibration of devices used in the comparison between cylinder usage and what the anaesthetic machines are saying?
I don't think they have.
There's a suggestion that clinical engineering can test this in a test environment.
What do you mean, like the checking whether what the machine is saying it's taking is actually correct? Is that what you're saying?
Can I ask James Harris to come in and just provide some background to the question? Yes, that's what he's saying.
Hi, it's James Harris. Sorry. So there's a lot of figures bandied around about the leak volume, right? And if you want to upset a medical gas engineer, it really gets to them. I think that the concern that they've got is that we obviously know what goes in at one end. We obviously know what the machine is telling you, but actually they can connect, clinical engineering can hook up an anaesthetic machine to a test environment and actually reconcile what the machine is, because the gap seems so big between what's going in at one end and what the machine is saying at the other. I'm not wanting to invalidate any of the work. It's just a really useful bit of work that clinical engineering in different hospitals could do, just to tie up that we're absolutely assured that the machines are giving us an accurate result.
Well, if you look at it, for some periods of time, even when the cylinders were being changed over, there was actually no usage at all of nitrous oxide. Like, you'd have weekends when there was no anaesthetic activity going on, and you'll still get turnover of the nitrous oxide cylinders in that time period. So it's just there was a large leak, and the medical gases engineers and things did actually come in, and they did actually identify that there was a leak in above the recovery area, and it was quite a substantial leak. So they did actually identify where the leak point was.
Thank you. Right, one more question. So anaesthetics and vaporizers are on national generic contracts. Are you linking in with the commercial medicines unit with this data to influence awards being given?
Was it to implement what being given, sorry?
Anaesthetics and vaporizers are on national generic contracts. Are you linking in with the commercial medicines units with this data to influence awards being given?
All right, no, not yet. No, we've just gone with our local drug procurement group. That's as far as we've got with it.
Thank you. Something for national people to pick up then. Thank you. Right. That is fantastic, thank you, and also really good to see the collaboration going on the chat. Please do continue to share any links to stuff that you think is relevant, useful. Thank you. So, Jamie.
Hi, thanks, Kathy. I'm Jamie Hyde. I work in the Green at NHS programme, which is part of NHS England and NHS Improvement. Thanks very much for having me here. I'll just start by giving a very sort of quick overview. I think this is not going to be new information for anyone, so I won't dwell on it. But if you just want to move on to the next slide to set the policy context, we have standards set through various sort of milestone documents, starting way back in the Climate Change Act 2008, the Long-Term Plan 2009, and the NHS Net Zero Report 2020. So just to set the scene of the direction of travel, and that we really are serious about this, it is being included in sort of the most important NHS policy and documents. Next slide, please. And then again, just to show that the overall sort of footprint of NHS emissions, anaesthetics is one of the only sources of direct emissions in terms of patient care, along with metered dose inhalers, and it is really a priority. It's so I think it was mentioned that it's around 2% of NHS emissions, but out of an actual hospital's emissions that are within the direct scope, it's a lot more than that, of course. Next slide, please. And again, just to reiterate the point, it is a big chunk of the pie, and it's and I think Tom's presentation really nicely sort of picked up on the issue that it's not only direct scope issue, it's also a supply chain issue, and that there is a lot of nuance in the way that the medicines are produced. So I'll come on to that in a second. Next slide, please. And again, this is reiteration of the same thing. We can move on to the next slide. So this is the trajectory for net zero as of last year, almost a year ago, when we published the report delivering a net zero NHS. There was a projected increase in activity. So that's the top line, which really, I think, underlines the urgency of taking action in this area. I think we can move on to the next slide, thanks. And this is a breakdown of the different sort of interventions that could be delivered by the different medicines focused interventions. So anaesthetics is really quite a big one, and that's included also in the bars to the right on innovation, pharma suppliers, research innovation, and so on. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we're doing about it, we're basically taking several approaches. There's the first one is to reduce the use of desflurane. In the current NHS standard contract, which all NHS trusts sign up to, there is a target to use no more than 10% desflurane out of overall volatile anaesthetics. We're currently in consultation for reducing that further. Obviously, as I said, this is not a simple area. There is a lot of nuance to it. So the priority has to be that we're not exposing patients to any risks by reducing it, but assuming that all goes to plan, there could be a further reduction in that. We're working with clinical representatives, the Royal College of Anaesthetics and the Association of Anaesthetists. We're developing alongside them some educational materials on low gas flow rates, which I think has been picked up by Tom, and seems to be a really key area, and also exploring the use of alternative methods of anesthesia, which I'm not going to go into detail on because I'm certainly not the expert out of this group on any of those. And we're promoting as much as possible the sort of development and the uptake of gas recapture, which I believe is going to be spoken about a bit later on. So that is the sort of headlines on volatile anaesthetic gases. The next slide, please. Nitrous oxide is it's a slightly more complicated area. I think that's been clear. It's used in various different settings in various different ways. It's obviously very cheap, effective, and readily available, and there isn't the same sort of clear alternative to nitrous oxide in the same way that sevoflurane could be substituted for desflurane. The work that was discussed in the previous presentation, I think, is such an important issue about waste. I don't know if Alethea is on the call, but sort of all credit goes to her for these findings. There were studies of sites where up to 95% of nitrous oxide that was being procured was not actually reaching patients, which is completely mind-boggling. There was, alongside the leaks, there was a few other issues that were identified, like, unfortunately, theft. There's, yeah, won't get into the details. That's not all we're here to talk about, but it does have a value for it as a recreational drug. So unfortunately, that does happen, and other kinds of stock management issues. I think one of the really key issues here is, and that's been clear from all of these presentations and the number of people who are active in this space, is coordination and bringing together all of the different sort of parties, so medical gas committees, pharmacists, anaesthetists, estates and facilities, and that, I don't know how familiar people are with the sort of the health technical memorandums. There is one on medical gases, and we think that could play perhaps a slightly stronger role in bringing different parties together. So yeah, next slide, please. And just a sort of, policy is obviously a cross-cutting issue across all of these areas, but some specific areas where we think there are opportunities is much closer working with MHRA. Obviously, they've had a few other priorities to be dealing with recently, so that's sort of a long-term conversation. There's currently barriers for both nitrous oxide and volatile anaesthetics in terms of their reuse and recapture, and also the top filling of cylinders. So when nitrous oxide is returned to the site, it has to be vented to the atmosphere. It can't be just topped up again for infection prevention control reasons. So a really key part of that conversation is the MHRA, who regulates these things. We've also been working with DEFRA on the regulation side. They're in the process of conducting a review on the fluorinated gas legislation, so more relevant to the volatile anaesthetic gases, and particularly Tom's presentation, I think raised a really key point about the manufacturing processes there. The health technical memorandum that I already mentioned, we think that probably could play a much stronger role than it does in the sort of coordination function. And of course, there's an international aspect, because we have sort of sources from all over the world telling us that the UK is using so much more nitrous oxide than anywhere else, and so we'd like to sort of explore that a bit more. But that's a conversation that's beginning. I think that might have been my last slide.
It is. Thank you, Jamie.
Great. Happy to take any questions.
It's helpful to see the policy context. We will be taking questions after the next two slides. So one of the things that is really very clear from looking across the landscape and listening to people today is, if we keep doing the same things, we'll get the same results, and we need to do something different. And we can't do that as in the NHS without support and ideas from outside of the NHS. So we've invited two companies to talk to us today. Jonas, over to you about Medclair.
Thank you very much, Katie. Happy to be here, and thank you very much for having me. Medclair, we're a green medtech company founded back in 2014, a Swedish company. We are experts in safe nitrous oxide usage, and we offer solutions related to detection, capture, and destruction of nitrous oxide. I don't think I need to tell this audience anything about the climate effects of nitrous oxide. That's been perfectly clear from previous presentations today. One other issue that we're working very much with is the work environment factor of exposing midwives and other medical staff to nitrous oxide, and that is the background of Medclair. Our founders were always aware of the climate issue, but back in 2014, unfortunately, not many people listened to them. Our technology is proven. We have had it verified by several third-party authorities, and all our products are manufactured with sustainability in mind. Would be rather pointless if not. I did mention the safe work environment, but already back in 2014, our founders, they had a target, or a goal rather, that they would like to bring this technology out in order to prevent the global warming issue. Up until 2019, the focus has been in Sweden. But since 2 years back, we are looking at the global expansion, and this is very much driven by the fact that there is an international increase of understanding of the climate crisis and the connection to nitrous oxide. For us, UK has been a very interesting market since quite a long time back, mostly driven by the fact that UK has a significant footprint in the nitrous society. The usage is, if I remember correctly now, roughly 1/3 of the European consumption of nitrous oxide. Since about 9 months back, UK became even more interesting due to the increased climate debate. At least as an external observer, I think I noticed an increase in the debate. There's been a very attractive traction in the debate as well. There are fewer and fewer of the climate deniers, and basically I think you can pretty much ignore them by now. And in the UK and in the NHS, we see a tremendous awareness of the need for change. As a Swedish, I would love our government and our healthcare society to have the same awareness of the need to do something about greenhouse gases. We had a dialogue with several hospitals actually since the beginning of 2021, and initially mostly with anesthesiologists. It's been basically doing something of an exploration phase. For us, it was quite clear early on that we should focus on obstetrics and maternity wards. They are the power users. There has been a few obstacles along the path. We were at the beginning aware of the obstacles in terms of explaining to the midwives that we need to add a scavenging system to the mouthpiece, or even better, start using a face mask. And we joined forces with the good folks over at BPR and their demand valves, and I think we overcame the obstacles fairly easily. And what we've seen is a very keen interest from the midwives. They're open to dialogue, more on that later on. We went on further. After talking lots to anesthesiologists, we started to get involved with people from estates, procurement, and last but not least, the Sustainability Society. And this in turn led to us being able to offer a few hospitals what we would like to call verification installations. Manchester using 2 mobile destruction units, and Lothian now in possession of 1 mobile destruction unit. However, Newcastle was the big case for us. We had a dialogue with Newcastle early on, and was apparent for us that they wanted to look at a big scale installation at the early stage. And we agreed with them to deliver 4 mobile destructors and 1 central destructor, along with a few nitrous oxide detectors. And if everything goes according to plan, and it should, we will see them start using them from October. Could we have next slide, please? Thank you. What we did a few weeks ago, we had a roadshow in the UK. We traveled along to the hospitals that we have delivered the test installations to, and we also visited a few others in London. We have been told early on that you will run into issues with the midwives. They are conservative, they don't like change. I would like to argue that this was not at all the case. What we have seen has been a tremendous interest and openness and acceptance of the need to adopt the work in order to capture nitrous oxide. And what we also noticed is a very keen interest on the factor of work exposure, the work environment hazard. And I think most midwives we talk to are quite surprised about the risk level, but also very delighted to see that we offer a solution. Can we have the next slide, please? For me personally, I think we hit a bit of a jackpot in Newcastle, where we had a mother at the same time as we visited, who was the first in UK to use our equipment, and resulting in a climate-friendly childbirth of little baby Rosie. Another effect of this was a great media interest. And what we saw as a result of the media interest is actually that the UK has a tremendous footprint in not only UK, of course, but also the rest of Europe and Australia, New Zealand, and North America. We have received lots of requests from these countries based on the event in Newcastle. Can we have next slide, please? We can take next slide immediately. Thank you. So, what are we doing now? Well, we are continuing the dialogue in the UK. We are establishing a network of partners, both in terms of distribution, but also service and installations. We are learning from the UK. We will probably be offering a specialized solution for the UK market due to the fact that UK childbirths has some differences to the ones in Sweden. We definitely see the need for our equipment in the UK, and there are a few challenges ahead. We have a very low percentage of AGS systems installed in obstetrics in the UK. We hope that there will be programs from a central level to increase those, because our technology benefits from large installations. But we are also looking at other solutions in that. If I should end by anything, it is that we are here to help you solve the issue of nitrous oxide. Our personal opinion, or our corporate opinion, is that nitrous oxide is a valuable tool in obstetrics, and we have the solutions to keep them. We also offer, somebody mentioned leakage. We're also looking at other industrial applications where we could help the NHS with handling the dismantling of all manifolds. We also have detection equipment to check leakage in manifolds. And last but not least, we want to put a bit of pressure on the gas society to handle the top-up issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was really interesting. And our final presentation of today is from SageTech. So if I could invite Matthew to talk to us about your waste anaesthetic capture and recycling.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kathy. So my name is Matt Gopal, and I represent SageTech Medical Equipment. SageTech is a company that was born in 2015, and I was friends with the founder, and as a veterinary surgeon, which was my previous job, we did a lot of the initial testing in the vet world, where it's slightly easier to gain access as it's private practice, but we use exactly the same drugs. So a lot of the initial testing was done in vets. It's interesting. We've heard all about the impact of the different drugs. So as Jonas said, I'm not going to go into the figures around all these drugs. We know that they're environmentally damaging, and we know that we need to do something about them. And as Jamie said in his talk, the anaesthetic gases are within scope 1 of the Net Zero delivery paper, and that's where we feel that we fit in this story, and this is where we can help. Just to give you some context, the most recent figure for volumes of volatiles used within the NHS England, the usage amounts up to 97,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalents per annum. So this is the figure that we would like to impact. and we feel that we can have a large impact on. Okay, if I could have the next slide, please. So again, to sort of cut a very long story short, because we're limited on time, SageTech have been running pilot studies for the last approximately 18 months in various pilot sites, those being Royal Cornwall, down in Truro, University Hospital Plymouth, Newcastle as well. We've already heard from Jonas how they are very environmentally minded as a trust. So we're working at the Fremantle and the Royal Devon and Exeter Trust as well, where a lot of the initial clinical work was carried out. Those are the pilot sites we have at the moment. I have to say we've had probably 40, in excess of 40 trusts come and ask whether they could be part of our pilot, and as we scale up, hopefully we will be able to engage with all of those trusts. So what do we actually do? Well, we have developed technology to capture waste anaesthetic gases, the vapours, from the exhaust of anaesthetic machines. So we capture the molecules of drug as they pass through the waste stream. We have tried to look at every step of our process and look at the environmental impact of each step. And to that effect, the first thing we wanted to do is make sure that the way that we capture, we've thought about environmental issues. So we have made our capture canisters able to be reused hundreds and thousands of times. We wanted to reduce the amount of waste that happens from single-use items. So that's why we have our stainless steel capture canister. These capture canisters are filled with a carbon media, and this is a functionalized carbon. And that, again, the carbon source is from a sustainable source. It's actually made from coconut husks, and it's treated in a particular way. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so the picture that you saw on the previous slide was our pilot aspect, and that's where we started. This image shows exactly what the medical device that we're designing will look like. So the really sort of key things about our device are that they are connected to the AHSN. Now that's the active gas scavenging system that is normally in position within the theatre or operating theatre block. And the reason for this is that we're connected in series, in line with the waste stream, so that if an anaesthetist wants to use nitrous, the nitrous goes straight through, but is still contained within the gas scavenging system and would be vented in the normal way. There were also some safety concerns around oxygen, and we were advised by the major manufacturers, the anaesthetic machine builders, that we should be wary of any leak of nitrous, obviously, but also leak of oxygen into the operating theatre. So we've tried to adhere to the requests from the anaesthetic machine builders. And the major ones that we're dealing with are GE and Draeger. So we connect our device via a hose from the anaesthetic machine into our medical device, and then from our medical device into the AHSN system of the hospital. Another key feature is that we're able to capture isoflurane, sevoflurane, and desflurane all on the same canister. There's no need for change. We can capture all three volatile agents on the same capture media. We would have an LCD screen that would alert the ODP or the anaesthetist to the level of filling of those canisters. So it would give a percentage of capacity that is still available for capture. And this would be looked at the start of a day's operating when the ODPs do their startup checks. And you would have an idea of how much capacity is left in the capture device. Should you exceed the capacity, we're still connected to the AHSN, so there's full safety in that respect. But what we don't want to have is further leak of volatiles into the environment. The capacity of these canisters, we have a bank of 4 canisters on our medical device, and these would need changing approximately once a month. So and that data is from our pilot studies so far. It would obviously depend on use. So if there was a particularly high use theatre, that may fill up quicker than others. Next slide, please. Okay, so what do we do once we've captured the drug? So the capture side of things has been a challenge, and then the extraction of that captured drug is, if you like, the next challenge. This is our extraction machine. We are currently talking with NHS supply chain to see if we can set up some form of a hub and spoke model, whereby we have our extraction machines within the hubs, of which there are 7 around the country, and the canisters would be transported from the central hub, and they would go out to the trusts that are involved in this type of technology. And then the extraction machine would empty the capture canisters of their drug. The way we do that is by utilising supercritical CO2, and I won't get too far into this, but it's CO2 at a particular temperature and pressure, and in that state it acts as a solvent and literally washes out the volatile into a bulk vessel, and that bulk vessel takes sevoflurane, isoflurane and desflurane. And then once we have enough of a volume, that would be separated through distillation and then purified through supercritical CO2, again through chromatography. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is probably the most important slide on here, I think, because it puts it into context. So this is data from an actual UK pilot site. This was through COVID, so it's slightly skewed. Possibly. This particular trust, there's 44 anaesthetic machines. SageTech are connected to 12 of these machines. So that's approximately 27% of their anaesthetic fleet. And over 7 months, we collected 24.1 kilograms of mixed volatile. Now, if we assume a mix of 10% isoflurane, 10% desflurane, and 80% sevoflurane, using Tom Pearce's CO2 calculator, we get to 14,800 kilograms of CO2 equivalents that was prevented from being released into the environment. So this is, it's a quarter of their machines over 7 months. So hopefully you can extrapolate that and potentially look at it for an annual use. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to finish, this is a paper that we actually used part of our Innovate UK funding. We've been entirely funded through grants as a company, and part of our IUK grant we wanted to use to put forward an independent study, and this was carried out by the European Centre for Human Health and Environment, and they looked at the carbon footprint of general anaesthetics in the UK. Now, the really important part of this is in the discussions section, and they using MAC hours as a way of comparing modes of anaesthesia. It would appear in the discussion sections that if you have sevoflurane and you have volatile capture, and you compare that with using propofol, which would be used in TIVA, if we use those, they're pretty much comparable in terms of CO2 equivalents. But that's using one single round of capture and recycle. If there's multiple rounds of capture and recycle of volatiles, that carbon impact would obviously decrease. So there may be a case for saying that volatiles and having recycle and capture might have an advantage over TIVA. But we as a company want to encourage use of all types of anaesthetic, and we want to give the choice back to the anaesthetist and not to have a guilty, if you like, a guilty anaesthesia. Interesting that Tom mentioned, and I think Jamie mentioned as well, manufacture of virgin drug. So by capturing these drugs, we also decrease the amount of manufacture of the virgin drug. And that's also to be taken into consideration. So hopefully, next slide, please. Hopefully that has given you a flavour of what we do. I'm more than happy. I've tried to squeeze all that into 10 minutes. If anybody wants to contact me separately, I'm more than happy to take questions and look at things in more detail. But thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Matt. That was. Thank you. So some questions that have come through. Some of them have been answered in the chat. So a question for Jonas. The Medclair, is it only for maternity settings, or can it be used in other clinical settings like A&E?
Yeah, the typical Swedish scenario is actually that we have a central destructor for obstetrics, and we have mobile destructors in A&E, pediatrics, burn units, and so on. So the only issue we have is actually general surgery, but I hope me and Matt will get to join up our systems and offer a turnkey solution for the entire hospital.
Absolutely.
Thank you. A question that came through, which I thought was really interesting, about how do you get hospitals to take up, how do trusts go about getting Medclair and SageTech technologies into their department? Both are still only in pilot phase. I think Jonas, you mentioned that yours is market ready. Matt, SageTech is being piloted in the UK. I would suggest that you'll both have some comments about how difficult or otherwise it is to get into the NHS, but Emma, I would suggest that you approach your local AHSN, which in your case would be Yorkshire and Humber, and we can give you some advice on this. I don't know, Matt, Jonas, whether you have any reflections on.
What we've seen is that there are influencers everywhere in society, and the medical society is no different. And hospital areas that have strong, outspoken staff with high environmental concerns and a strong agenda, they typically get the attention in the entire organization, and that's where we come in.
It's really interesting, actually. I happened to be on a call the other day, and it was something that really woke me up. Somebody mentioned environmental currency and carbon currency, and it was this move away from putting a financial. There is finance involved. You know, you have to buy these technologies. But actually the impact of them is huge to our environment, or could potentially be. So I think that mindswell, that change that needs to happen, where we look at the environmental impact rather than the financial impact, is something that hopefully will grow over time.
Yeah,
that's actually, sorry, Jonas.
I fully agree, and we see this in New Zealand, for instance. There are talks, or if it's already implemented, where hospitals actually are part of the emission rights program, and then you quickly discover the cost of 1 ton of CO2. It's rather significant.
And that does segue us nicely onto a question that was asked around potential financial opportunities associated with both, that could help offset the cost of change and generate broader support. You're talking about environmental currency. That hasn't, I think, seeped through into the majority of trusts as being a currency that is tangible and worth something. So do you have a financial element to your business case?
Was that question for me or for Matthew?
For either, sorry, for both and either of you. It's basically, are there any savings to be made that we could use to convince finance directors?
Well, Matthew, you first.
Yeah, thank you, Jonas. So it was interesting on a couple of those slides earlier. We saw, I think it was Joy put up that they had made some financial savings through using particular agents and not using particular agents. And it just, I've been speaking with some trusts that are saying, well, can they speak to their individual financial directors and say, we've made this saving here. Can we spend this saving on a particular type of technology, whether it be nitrous cracking or whether it be volatile capture? Either way, we're trying to make an environmental saving. That's the drive.
Fully agree. And from my perspective, what we would like to see in the UK is a work environment study, because I mean, you can calculate the credits in many ways, and I'm certain that we will see increase in staff health in maternity wards once we start scavenging nitrous properly, and that's a saving. But now I'm a bit blunt and perhaps a bit brutish in what I say, but what is the cost of not working against climate change?
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't think any of the audience here today would disagree with that.
No, it's the easy audience today in that terms.
A more technical question around sorry, where's it gone? Separating iso and desflurane. Apparently they can be difficult to work with if captured together.
No, we can separate those pretty easily through distillation. So that's how they're separated. All three of the drugs, iso, sevo, des, are all separated on their boiling points in a specific distillation process.
Thank you. That answers the question. Are you aware of any regulatory support or and/or route for recycling back into use of volatiles? Now, Jamie might want to come in here if he's aware of anything, but I have heard that MHRA are looking at recycling of gases. I don't know whether either of you, Matt or Jonas or Jamie, have heard of anything.
Yeah, well, I can certainly come in here and say that the MHRA, our discussions with them so far have led to a timeline that's been set out. We have a plan to work to with the MHRA. There are obvious sort of milestones within that. Bioburden would be a massive part of that. The one thing we would say about our process is that anything that survives supercritical CO2 is doing very well. Our process of sort of the extraction side of things utilizes very high pressures and certain temperatures that are also used in forming bone grafts, allograft tissue. So it kills everything basically. So we don't expect there to be much of a bioburden. But yes, there's a set process to go through. I don't know whether Jamie knows any more about the MHRA.
No, sorry, no other updates from that.
Thank you. I only heard it in passing this morning, so thank you, Carl Lynch, for that. I think we've come to the end of our session. There are some questions that are still unanswered. The chat is there for any responses. Jonas and Matthew have shared their contact details. If people are interested, I'm sure they'd be happy for you to get in touch. But I wanted to say a huge thank you to all of our speakers today, because this has been a really interesting, fascinating and useful session. Thank you so much. Slides and recordings will be available after the event. We'll send around the links to you. And please do share as widely as you feel appropriate. And we expect the next event in January, beginning of February, to be on asthma inhalers. And as I said earlier, we're running these quarterly. Keep an eye out for future events. Spread the word if you find them useful. And we look forward to seeing all or some of you again in the future. Thank you very much. Have a fantastic rest of the week. Bye.